Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is on writing good survey questions. On the screen, we're going to run through a PowerPoint and we'll talk about these items. So the general principle for designing good survey instruments is that the strength of the survey research has to be about asking people about their firsthand experiences. So that's what they have done, their current situations, their feeling, and their perceptions. Please avoid asking questions in which people don't have informed answers. So if you're going to ask students about what their parents think, it's not a good approach. You want to ask parents directly about what they think, and you want to ask parents directly about their behaviors. So first rule of thumb, always ask about firsthand experience, what people have done, what their situations are, what their feelings and perceptions are. So what's a good question? A good question is one that provides answers that are reliable and valid measures of something you want to describe. Reliability equals consistency. So you get an answer reliably every time that you answer that question. Validity, on the other hand, when it's in relation to survey research, refers to does this question answer, does it address the idea that it was meant to address? So does it measure what it was actually designed to measure? So we'll talk through 5 basic characteristics of good questions and answers. So 1, questions need to be consistently understood. So that means every person that reads that question, regardless of their background in your audience, should be able to consistently understand it. If you have a question and you give it to 10 people and those 10 people all interpret it differently, that's not a question that's consistently understood, so therefore it's not going to be a valid question. Questions, item number 2, questions need to be consistently administered and communicated to respondents. So you want the recipients to get the questions in a similar way and communicated to them in a similar way. So if the questions are on an online survey, you want them all to receive those questions in the same way, administered to them in the same way at about the same time, so that there isn't a lot of contextual things that happen that can impact the responses. Characteristic number 3, what constitutes an adequate answer should be consistently communicated. So when someone is getting a question, it should be clear to them how it is you want the answer to be received. So if you have a multiple choice question, it should be clear that you only want them to circle 1. Or if you want them to check all that could apply, you need to make that clear in the question. Otherwise, you'll get lots of different ways that the data gets responded back to them. Additionally, it has to be consistently communicated to them. So if you have an open-ended response, if you only want the top 3 items, then give them 3 lines and limit how much they can actually fill in. If you want a paragraph response, be sure to tell them how it is you want that response communicated back. Characteristic number 4, all responses should have access to the information to answer the question accurately. So you have to ask them about firsthand experiences. You have to ask them questions in which they actually know the answers to or can know the answers to. The exception here is if you are doing a question to ask about knowledge generation. So if you're a teacher and you're giving a test question, it's okay if they don't know the answer because they didn't study. So that's what's meant in the exception here on the slide of if the measurement is of knowledge is the goal of the question, then it's okay if they don't have access to the information because perhaps they didn't gain that knowledge. But if the purpose of the question is to get perception, experience, demographic data, etc., then they should have access to that information. And that means that you have to ask them about what they have done, what they have learned, or access information they have access to. And number 5, the respondents have to be willing to provide the answers to you. So if you're going to ask people things that you don't think you're going to get the answers to, or that if you're getting, if it's not anonymous per se and it's sensitive information they're not going to provide you, then you don't want to ask those questions. One good example of this is the income question. Americans in general are very sensitive about the way that whether or not they'll receive how much money that they make. Seems to be a very sensitive topic. So if you ask the question, how much money did you make in the last annual year, and then outline the years January 1st to December 31st, and you leave that as an open-ended response, you may get a lot of blanks because people don't want to put a number down. However, if you ask the question by giving a range, so that people are giving a range, you might be more likely to get the answer because they didn't have access to their W-2, they didn't know, or they didn't want to share it, but they might be more willing to give you a range. An important part of survey research is the evaluation of the survey questions. So there are 2 ways to evaluate survey questions. One is there's an evaluation of how well the questions meet the standards, the ones that we talked about above, or evaluation of the validity of the answers. We're going to skip over this, but we're going to come back to writing some good survey questions. So each question has to have an objective or a reason. So for every question that you put on your survey for your survey project, I'd like you to make sure that it's actually answering a question that you hope to know. You don't want to get in a habit of just asking questions because they seem to be the questions that everybody else asks. So you want to actually have an objective for each of your questions. The question objective that you're referring to decides what kind of information you want to achieve. So if your purpose is to ask a question about the age of the participants to know whether the students you're providing services to are receiving it in a, if first-year students versus last-year students are receiving the information differently, then you're going to want to ask, what grade level they're in, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, rather than ask them their biological age. Their biological age may not be reflective of where they are if they're a non-traditional student who's in higher education. So always think about what it is you're trying to get to, what's your objective of asking this question, because it will help you figure out how to answer it, and also which answer choices you're going to give, whether it's going to be open-ended or whether it's something that you're going to be giving some categories to. The overall point of objectives is that the question objectives can only be defined within the context of the analysis plan and a clear view of how the information will be used to meet the overall research objectives. So before you set out to write a survey, you have to be really clear on what your objectives are for the survey overall. So figure out what it is I want to gather from this audience, who the audience is, and then what do I want to know before you start writing individual questions. Then you should be able to map out how these questions match to your objective. If you have questions that don't actually link to any particular objective, then you don't really need to ask those on their survey. So I want you to consider 2 objectives, age and income, let's say. So if your objective is to get age, you could ask, how old were you on your last birthday? Or you could ask, on what date were you born? In this case, the answers should be similar. For if your objective was to get income, There are a lot of different ways to ask this. You could ask, how much money do you make per month on your current job? So you've got to put the time frame in there. You could ask, how much money did you make in the last 12 months from all paid jobs? That response could be different than the one above. So the way you go about asking this question is the way that you're going to get the responses. And if you're vague in the way that you answer the question, you'll get vague responses that will be hard for you to analyze later. A third way to go about asking this is, what was the total income for you, all family members living with you in your home, from jobs and from other sources during the last calendar year? So you're going to get different answers from these different questions. Each might be okay, but depending on what you want to know will depend on which way you should be asking this question. In the above example, the question objective needs to be more specific than just income. Why do you want to know that income? So now we're going to look at two different kinds of questions. Questions that deal with factual data is where we'll start. So there's two approaches to ensuring consistency on how respondents understand questions with factual data. You have to define concepts and terms in a question. So you're going to want to provide a complete definition of key terms and concepts. So with long definitions, you may need to break that down into several different questions. And you're going to want to provide all information needed so that the respondents can properly answer the questions. So here's an example. When you know there's some potential confusion, here's some example. Let's suppose your objective is to find out about people's weekly consumption of butter. I know, odd question, but hopefully easy enough to understand. If we know that people confuse butter and margarine consumption, we could ask, in the past week, not counting any margarine you may have eaten, how many days did you have butter? So thinking about the terms that you have and defining them or excluding other items is important, because it comes back to item number one that we talked about. People have to consistently understand the question to be able to get answers that you can aggregate and think about. So thinking about knowing and remembering. Once you know all respondents understand the question in the same way, so you've figured out that you're going to get real butter answers and not margarine answers in the last example, because you've been clear that they understand that you're excluding margarine. You still need to consider whether the people actually have information they need to answer the question and that they're willing to answer it. So there's a couple of possible problems with knowing and remembering in relation to survey research. The respondent may not have the information that they need. The respondent may not have known in the past, but have forgotten. The respondents may recall, but they have trouble putting it into the proper time frame. So again, we have the dog barking issue, which is going to be taken care of right now by my son. He's going to lock them up for me. Thank you. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you fast forwarded through the dog barking. The respondents may recall, but may have trouble putting it into the proper time frame. So I think the next illustrations will make sense. So here's some examples that show those problems that I was just talking about. Number one, how many rolls of paper towels have you bought in the last year? Now, do you think people would have access to, do you think they would actually remember that? They might be able to estimate, they may confuse it with napkins, but will they remember that information? Number two, when you were 6 years old, did your parents ever spank you? So this illustrates the problem of asking people to think back to too far along, they may not remember the information or they may misremember the information. You always want to ask people about current experience or experience that would be easy for them to access in a short amount of time. So when it is you survey them is pretty important, because research has shown that you get better responses when you survey people quickly and they have immediate access to that experience to reflect on. Question number 3. In the last 2 months, have you purchased products manufactured in Japan? So they may be able to, the time frame, they might be able to give you a sense of what they've purchased in the last 2 months. I don't know. During this whole COVID thing, I bought an awful lot of things on Amazon. Now, do I actually know if they were manufactured in Japan? I might have to say I don't know to an answer like that, because I might not check all the time unless I always buy US. So again, another kind of hard question to answer using those examples up above. And then how many miles is your house from wherever it might be? It could be, this town, it could be any town. The person has to know where this place is to know how far away their house is. So depending on the audience, if your audience all know where this place is on the screen, they may be able to tell you if they have a good sense of miles. If your audience, for example, was non-US, they may not use miles, so miles may be hard. So you always have to think about units of measurement, and situating a question, giving them enough information and making sure that they can actually answer the questions, that they can know and remember. So in addition, your respondents must be willing to answer the questions. Otherwise, you'll get some inaccurate responses. So here's a couple of examples of questions that you can ask. They're not terrible questions, but people may not want to be willing to actually give you the answers. So it's, you may want to think about asking questions like this if you can't actually get the answers to it. One of them is, how old are you? I don't know, maybe many of you are not very sensitive about your age, but when you get to be my age, you can, and are a female, you might be a little sensitive about it. Some people are uncomfortable at telling you how old they are, or even giving you a date of birth because they're worried about identity theft. If you give them an age range, you might be more likely to get a response on that question than an open-ended question. And then the question of, have you ever cheated on an exam? This gets to something we were talking about in the research and ethics class. They may not be willing to give you a response at all, or they may not be willing to give you an honest response because of an idea called social responsibility, and they don't want to be perceived as someone who does something negative. They also could be afraid of repercussion, of sharing information that they've done that could hurt them or get them kicked out of school, for example, particularly if you're giving the exam in a way where it could possibly be pointed back to them. So those are examples of questions where people may not be willing to actually give you the answer to the questions. You probably have some other reasons why those questions are not good questions. So the form of an answer is as important as the question itself. I'll repeat that. The form of the answer or the answer selections are as important as the questions themselves. Most questions specify the forms of the answers that are supposed to take. And you have to give people, the form of the answer must fit the answer the respondent wants to give you or is prepared to give you. So here's a potential problem question. On days where you drink any alcohol at all, how many drinks do you usually have? So this question asks about usual behavior. These kind of questions work best if there isn't a lot of variability. A question like, how old are you? It works well for some groups, but not for others. you might have to consider changing the form of the answers to categories in these kinds of situations. So how old are you? I might need to give age ranges for some group rather than leaving it as an open-ended question. On days where you drink any alcohol, how many drinks do you usually have? So that's asking people to reflect back on a lot of different days that they might use alcohol, and then they might not give you the response that they would want to have. And sometimes that can vary from time to time, so it's hard for them to actually give you a response. So one thing you want to do, and I've already alluded to it today in this lecture, is reduce the effects of social desirability. We're human beings, and we all want to be socially accepted, most of us, and want to give, it's natural for people to give answers that they think you want to hear or that they think are desirable. And sometimes accuracy is distorted by people's tendency to want to answer in ways that will make them look better or avoid making them look bad. And this phenomenon is called social desirability. So social desirability is the phenomenon of um, respondents answering in a way that makes them feel better, look better, or wants to give you what you want to hear. And sometimes you're not getting the truth. Our goal is to always get what's actually happening, what people actually feel, and what people actually experience, not what they want us to think about them. So we have to try to do things as researchers to reduce the effect of social desirability. Sometimes surveys will ask questions to which the answers could pose a threat to the subject. So, how many affairs have you had in the last year? Now, not too many people are going to answer this honestly. In this case, respondents will not usually report accurately because they might feel that their answers may be disclosed. They may not be willing to admit it to themselves, nevertheless to you. And there could be fear that the results would be shared with other people. So asking people these kinds of very sensitive questions in the form of a survey question, particularly a written survey, as opposed to an in-person survey, can be very challenging. There may be times when answering the question accurately could actually be at odds with how the respondent wants to think about himself or herself. So, for example, questions about drug use may be sensitive to people who don't want to admit that they're actually taking drugs. This issue is not so much about the sensitive questions, because you can ask the questions, but about the answers. So people will vary. A question about drinking and driving is not really sensitive to someone who doesn't drink or drive, but if it is sensitive to someone who does this and who maybe got into an accident or who maybe have hurt someone unintentionally. Um, so usually when we're talking about sensitive questions, it's actually, the question itself is not sensitive. It's the way it makes people feel, and it's the responses that they can give that are sensitive. So to reduce the effects of social desirability, you have to do your best to ensure confidentiality or anonymity. As discussed in our previous class, the distinction between confidentiality or anonymity is there's no way this person can be found out at all. There's no ID that's going to connect them. There's no name. The researcher can have no way to possibly know how this is. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is there may be a way to actually trace back who it is, but the researcher is not going to share that outside and will have complete confidentiality. Anonymity is going to reduce the effects of social desirability more than confidentiality, but confidentiality, if anonymity is not possible, confidentiality is the next best thing. You have to emphasize the importance of accuracy. So when you are laying out the survey in your instructions, be really clear that you want accurate responses from them. That will help reduce the effects of social desirability by letting them know that you really want to know what they think or what they do. If you can use a self-administration of a survey, so that means an online survey or a mail survey, rather than an interview, a survey interview, that's going to help to reduce the effects of social desirability because it increases confidentiality and anonymity. When you have interviews that you can't be anonymous, you can be confidential, but they may be still worried about what you think or how you might view them, or you might tell others how they feel. Also, when you're designing the questions, explain the purpose of the questions, phrase the questions in as neutral way possible. So you want to reduce leading questions. So if you start a question in a leading way, and you'll see this in some of the other readings that you're doing tonight. So if you lead them to think most people think a certain way and then ask them how they think, they're going to want to think like most people think. So you want to phrase questions in a very neutral way. Now we're moving to questions to measure subjective states. So subjective states are things that are not just things that people have done, but more about how people feel. So many surveys seek to get information about perceptions, feelings, opinions about themselves or about others. And your basic task when developing these kinds of questions is to place the answer on a continuum usually. There's usually no right or wrong answers, because there isn't an objective standard in which the answers can be measured. We have to rely and depend on the answers themselves. So a good subjective question has all the same characteristics of a good objective question. And writing those questions, we need to write them in a way so that answers can be placed on a continuum. We need to define for the respondent what it is to be rated. We need to show the dimension or continuum the rated object is to be placed on, and we need to make clear the characteristics of the continuum. Now we'll get to some examples of that. So to define what it is to be rated, it's important that all respondents should be answering the same question. Small differences in wording can have a big effect on the result. So, case in hand, do you consider crime to be a big problem, some problem, or no problem at all? So crime is a very general term. You have to be clear what kind of crime you're talking about and where the crime is. Otherwise, it's hard for people to respond to this question. You could have one person thinking of crime as littering, and you could have another person thinking of crime as murder. Their kinds of responses would be very different because they're thinking about very different kinds of crimes. So you need your question to be written in a way so that it's clear what the person is responding to. Defining the nature of the response. There are two different strategies for evoking answers from respondents. The most common is to put the answers on a continuum. So rating scales, putting answers on a continuum. Questions can differ in ways that respondents are asked to use a continuum. So one continuum would be from excellent to poor, being very clear what excellent is, very good, good, fair, or poor. Each item on that continuum has an anchor, meaning if I answered excellent and that has a number 1 next to it, I know number 1 means excellent. If I answer number 2, I know that that means very good. If I answer number 3, I know that means good. If I answer 4, that's fair, and if I answer 5, that's poor. You could also have a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 represents the best your health can be, and where 0 is the worst your health can be. And the other numbers represent health states in between. What number would you give your health? So overall, each of these scales have strengths and weaknesses. You have to assess what kind of scale you want to use and what kind of terms you are going to use and how you're going to analyze the data to decide what kind of continuum you're going to use. In all cases of rating scales, there's two major questions about the categories. Number 1 is how many categories are you going to have? And number 2, are you going to use numbers or are you going to use adjectives? So here's an example showing different numbers of categories. Consider the question, rate the job President Obama has done as president. So you could have a couple of different approaches to the answer choices. You could have good job, not good job. Could have some kind of scale related to that. Kind of simple. Forces people to choose one side or not or another. I don't know. You think that's a great scale? Another way to do it would be to ask, is it an excellent job, a very good job, fair job, poor job? Or finally, you could ask, on a scale of 10 to 1, with 10 being excellent and 1 being terrible, making it clear what's the high side and what's the low side, what's the best job that President Obama has done. So there's different ways that you could go about having your answer categories on the scales that will depend on what you can actually do with the data. So some general guidelines about the number or of categories that you're going to give. There's practically a limit on how many categories you can name and distinguish. Also, there are limits as to the number of distinctions that respondents can make. Previous research suggests 10 is definitely the maximum number of categories that respondents can use. People understand a scale of 1 to 10. You know, if you do a scale of 1 to 100, people are either going to give you 100 or 0. They're not going to give you a lot. There's not a real lot of distinction in between. So really the best to do is no more than 1 to 10. 5 to 7 categories rather than a numeric scale of 0 to 10 could even be better. And if you're doing sort of a verbal survey, telephone survey, or a survey that is over online, but in person where you're doing an interview, even fewer categories might be better because it will take you a long time to talk through all the categories. Overall, the extent that valid information can be obtained, more categories are better than fewer. You don't want to have only 2 choices. You want to have enough, but you don't want so many that they're not exactly sure what to choose on categories. If you're unsure of your category choices, give someone, you can always have a choose not to answer or prefer not to answer. And we'll talk about this in class because there's lots of different schools of thought on that. The advantage of using adjective is that all points are calibrated by words. So when you ask for a scale, a numerical scale without adjectives 0 to 10, it may not be clear what really the difference is between number 5 and number 6, or number 5 and number 8, and how people view those things may be different. I could just be someone that gives everybody a 10 because I'm a really nice person, or I could be a really mean person and always give people 1s, whereas the other respondent sees those scales differently. So there is an advantage that you can have words actually calibrating so that you know a 1 means never and a 2 means sometimes. The disadvantages are that it's hard to think up of adjectives for more than 5 or 6 categories. So to have adjectives for 10 for items 0 through 10 is hard. Having adjectives for 4 or 5, that makes more sense. If you're doing a cross-cultural study, the adjectives may not always translate well because some cultures may use those adjectives in one way and another culture may use it in another. And that really speaks to really understanding the audience that you have in front of you and how it is you think that audience or that sample population that you selected will receive the survey data. The advantage of using numbers is that they're easy to use and easy to keep in mind. So if you're asking multiple questions in a row, it's easy for them to move through when you have multiple numerical answers and you know the next 5 questions are going to use 0 to 10. If they're adjectives, they may have to keep referring back to the adjectives. You can also use an agree-disagree format instead of a rating continuum on when you're asking questions related to subjective states, but you have to be careful. Um, so a question like, my health is good, strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Um, so what are the problems that you see here? It's a little bit ambiguous, right? What I think is good may not actually be good. Or maybe I feel my health is good because I had chemo last year. And this year I have corona, but it's not as bad as when I had cancer. Um, Very, very hard question to ask that generically, and it's very subjective. So the responses you'll get will vary widely. You could have someone that says that their health is not good, and a doctor may say otherwise. So kind of hard to use those responses for a question like this. So you can use agree and disagree for questions for sure, but be sure that the topic at hand is one that it's clear that most people would agree or disagree and receive the question in the same way. Um, you can also have people rank things, and there's 4 different approaches to ranking. You could give them a list and ask them to rank order a list. So if the list is short and if you have opinion about the choices, then that might be a helpful thing to do. It could be okay to do that. But otherwise, it's not really, the best way just to have them. You could give the respondents a list of options and ask them to name the most extreme. So from the list below, pick the 2 you prefer most. That might be easier for a participant to do, to sort of pick their favorite from the top 2 below, or pick the 2 top things that come to mind. It's something some people usually have a sense of and can respond to. You could ask people to make a series of paired comparisons. So it could be, one political candidate to another, or one higher ed office to another. What do you like better? Do you like this or that? My son does this all the time on, I don't know, social media. He'll have these this or that pictures and be asked what he likes better. So having paired comparisons. Um, might be interesting. They're actually very hard to analyze that way and can be very time consuming when it comes to the analysis. So it's not something I would recommend per se as an ongoing approach. You could also give the respondents a list and ask them to rate each item using a scale. In other words, that's turning it into a ranking, into a rating task, which is usually the best solution. So if you're going to choose to do rankings, I would say to do that sparingly and carefully. And if you are going to do rankings, you might, instead of having them rank orders thing, a list of 20 things, you might want to ask them for their top 2 or 3. You want to be careful and use this approach judiciously. It's a little hard to analyze the data, and sometimes it's hard for people to respond to the data depending on how it's asked. Now, narrative answers or open-ended questions, you give open-ended answers, so just a freestyle question. You can use these when you don't want or don't know how to limit the answers. So if you can't come up with a list of 5 to 7 categories and you think there's probably 100 different categories for them to pick from, then you want to use something open-ended. If you don't know, the possible answers could be long, or you're just not sure, or you're really just asking a question, you have no idea what the answers could be, then it's appropriate to use open-ended. If you think that you have a question that if you gave them response choices, it would actually bias the results, then you could just see how it is that they responded to an open-ended question. A note about open-ended responses and questions using them, you want to use them sparingly, because to analyze them takes an awful lot of work. Narrative answers are hard to analyze. They're time consuming for the respondents to fill out. If they have too many of them, they might skip them. Think about them as the long answer, like short answers on a test. It's the thing people hate to do. They prefer to do their multiple choice. And sometimes people like to skip questions that seem time consuming. If it's not a survey that's not very interesting to them, they might simply leave the answers blank. So here's some other topics I wish we had more time for, but you've already listened to this lecture for long enough, is how we would evaluate questions before we include them in our survey, and how to design items with an understanding of how they'll be analyzed. Hopefully we'll talk more about these in class, and we'll talk more about the other readings that you're doing this week. And we'll use some examples in class to rewrite some questions and put some of these skills to test. We'll also talk more about your survey assignment and answer lots of questions or any questions that you may have about that. Thank you for your time and attention. And again, I apologize for the interruption with the dogs during this session. Look forward to seeing you all on Thursday.